Hey everyone, Dr. Steve here. You know it as well as I do, but most students need a B or better in A&P. But did you know that students are doing that all over the US using my Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite as a low-cost alternative to expensive textbooks? Digital Suite delivers the key concepts of A&P with short, assignable tutor videos and a bulleted narrative study guide that not only explain the concepts of A&P, they show them happening. Combined with state-of-the-art dissection and physiology lab simulations and a vast question bank for quizzes, homework assignments, and exams, Digital Suite meets students where they are and gives them the tools to master the content. It's the perfect supplement to an OER textbook or just on its own. If you're an A&P instructor, contact your McGraw-Hill representative today and ask about Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite. If you're a student, tell your instructor about it. There's a link to Digital Suite in the show notes of this episode. Get your B or better in A&P with A&P Digital Suite.
Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is Believe.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my podcast, Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Sullivan, coming to you from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia, where I've been teaching A&P since 2002. In this episode, we are turning our attention to a part of the body that has historically received far less attention than muscles, bones, nerves, and organs, but is increasingly recognized as an important contributor to movement, stability, pain, and overall function. We are talking about fascia. While we'll learn that an exact definition of fascia is not agreed upon, I think it's safe to say that fascia is a continuous network of connective tissue that surrounds, supports, separates, and connects structures throughout the body. It wraps around muscles, groups of muscles, nerves, blood vessels, and internal organs, helping the tissues of the body move in relation to one another. Although fascia was once treated primarily as packing material that anatomists had to cut through to reach more quote-unquote important structures, researchers and clinicians now understand that it is a dynamic, living tissue with sensory, mechanical, and potentially significant clinical roles. When fascia becomes restricted, irritated, or less mobile, which can be from a variety of reasons like an injury, a surgery, inflammation, repetitive movement, poor posture, or prolonged inactivity, it may contribute to stiffness, reduced range of motion, and pain. One treatment approach designed to address these restrictions is myofascial release therapy. Myofascial release uses sustained, carefully directed pressure and stretching techniques intended to improve the mobility of the fascia and surrounding soft tissues. To help us understand fascia and the clinical use of myofascial release, my guest is Dr. Kate Oland, a doctor of physical therapy who incorporates myofascial release therapy into her practice. Dr. Oland is an A&P instructor, entrepreneur, and expert-level myofascial release therapist with more than 20 years of clinical experience. She has dedicated her clinical practice to fascia-focused care while becoming an advocate for bringing contemporary fascial science into undergraduate anatomy and physiology education. She's also the founder of Thrive Holistic Physical Therapy and of Thrive Everywhere, a healthcare education and technology platform designed to help people better understand their healthcare options and connect with private practice clinicians. And she's a podcast host. She hosts The Healing Journey, a podcast that uses education and vulnerable conversation to explore the many dimensions of healing. We will discuss what fascia is, why it matters, what a myofascial restriction may feel like, and what patients can expect during a myofascial release treatment session. We also examine what the scientific evidence tells us about this therapy, where questions remain, and how it may fit within a broader physical therapy treatment plan. I also talked to Dr. Oland about physical therapy as a profession, including what inspired her to become a physical therapist, what education and clinical training are required to earn a doctor of physical therapy degree, and what the day-to-day work of a physical therapist might look like. For students considering careers in healthcare, physical therapy offers an opportunity to combine anatomy, physiology, biomechanics, problem-solving, and personal interaction while helping patients regain movement, independence, and quality of life. So whether you're an anatomy and physiology student, a future healthcare professional, someone living with chronic pain or restricted movement, or simply curious about the connective tissue network that extends throughout your body, this conversation will give you a deeper appreciation of fascia and the professionals who help patients move and function more effectively. And as always, this podcast is intended for educational purposes only. In no way should the content you hear in this or any episode be taken as direct medical advice. If you or someone you know is experiencing any of the signs or symptoms that you hear about in any episode of this show, please contact a healthcare professional immediately for a proper and thorough evaluation. Having said that, let's begin our discussion of fascia, myofascial release therapy, and physical therapy as a career with Dr. Kate Oland. Okay, thank you, Dr. Kate Oland, for joining me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I want to start off with letting the listeners know who you are and what you do.
So I started off as a physical therapist working in our American healthcare model, and that's been about 20 years of work. And the model's changed a lot since I started working. I've worked in outpatient, I've worked in home care, I've worked in hospitals, but more recently I've begun practicing myofascial release in my private practice, which is something I can't wait to talk more about with you. I also have been an adjunct instructor at St. Louis University, where I teach students in the Department of Clinical Health Sciences, so students going into various healthcare professions. And that little job has had a huge impact on my life, marrying, fascia work with education and seeing the gap in education when it comes to fascia in the classroom. And that is where I've become really passionate, trying to make sure that everyone gets the opportunity to learn about this fascinating tissue.
Okay, so I've heard a lot about fascia, I've read a lot about fascia, and I want to get into that a little bit later. But first, I want to start off asking you about being a physical therapist, because you are the first physical therapist I've had on the show, believe it or not. And so, as a physical therapist, what kinds of patients or conditions do you mostly work with?
Sure. Well, I am on a mission to become a rich and famous physical therapist. So I love that I'm the only PT who's been on your show. I'll let you know when I meet that goal. um, so as a PT, I've worked in multiple settings. So I've worked with, in my career, I have worked with all different types of conditions. But 5 years ago, I started my own private practice as a myofascial release therapist. And that has changed the demographic of my client significantly. I would say most people who seek out fascia work in my practice are people who are experiencing pain. And sometimes that's chronic pain. And I think people with chronic pain tend to respond well to myofascial release. Very often, people who are experiencing chronic pain have tried a lot of things before they come to my office. I think I actually have some clients that are driving 90 minutes to get to me because they can't find a fascia therapist near them. So chronic conditions that I really love to connect with the people who are suffering, and it is suffering from fibromyalgia, endometriosis, chronic fatigue syndrome. Those are some conditions that don't have great medical options. And there are some very powerful clinical case studies where people who have had relief with no other form of treatment become, if not pain-free, their pain is under control through fascia work. And that's where I really am passionate about doing the work I do for people who are really some of the most vulnerable patients out there.
Okay, so what originally inspired you to become a physical therapist, and how did your education and early clinical experiences eventually lead you to think about specializing in myofascial release?
Okay, yeah. So, there are a couple points in my high school time that really inspired me to become a physical therapist. And one point in particular, I watched a Harrison Ford movie. It came out in 1991, and it's called Regarding Henry. And Harrison Ford plays a bigwig business guy who sustains a traumatic brain injury. And there's a supporting role, I can't remember the actor's name, but a supporting role playing the physical therapist. And I just remember seeing that and seeing these two humans, very different, they're different races, very different lifestyles, but how that therapist found ways to connect with his patient. And in this case, helped him learn how to walk again, which I went into physical therapy school thinking that's all I was going to do was help people learn how to walk. But thank goodness there's so many other different avenues to explore in my profession. There's so much more to it than that. But that was an inspiring moment for me.
I just want to mention here that the actor in question was Bill Nunn. Bill Nunn was known not only for Regarding Henry, but also for multiple Spike Lee films like School Days and Do the Right Thing, as well as playing the editor of the Daily Bugle in the Spider-Man movies of the early 2000s. Unfortunately, Bill Nunn passed away from leukemia at the young age of 62 in 2016.
Growing up, also, my best friend from childhood, we were in first grade together, and her baby brother was just a little baby at that time, but her brother has Down syndrome, and I really watched their family navigate different aspects of what that was like to have someone with special needs in their home, and seeing the work that was being done that interested me to be able to help people in that way.
I've had very positive experiences with physical therapists myself. I had rotator cuff surgery a couple of years ago, and I actually loved going to PT because I saw the progress I was making day to day to day. I'm a tennis player, and getting back on the tennis court was my number one goal, even though it took 7 months after the surgery. But seeing the progress day to day was great. But I want to talk about fascia, which I know that's what your passion is right now. And I saw you present at our national conference of the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society back in May, and I was really intrigued by what you were presenting. And also, I saw the common lecture about fascia that, well, I forget the gentleman's name,
It was Dr. Alan Denton who gave that presentation.
and that was really intriguing because most anatomy students are taught that fascia is essentially connective tissue that wraps muscles and separates structures. But based on the newer research that you're talking about, how should we now define fascia and how has our understanding of it changed?
I wish that was an easy question to answer, right? What is the definition of fascia? That is the beginning of, educating A&P students. And as I mentioned before, I am really passionate about trying to get more information about fascia into the curriculum. But one of the major roadblocks I'm hitting is that we don't have a standardized definition of fascia. And it is above my pay grade to define the anatomical human body. And I bet there's some people out there sighing of relief, right? That's not my job. And I caught myself while I was educating, I caught myself maybe trying to do that a little bit because I think fascia is so important. But there are other governing bodies that determine internationally how we use anatomical definitions. Now, I went to the Fascia Research Congress last year. That's an event that happens every 3 years. It's hosted by the Fascia Research Society. They have the Fascia Nomenclature Committee. There are people working on how to define fascia. So that being said, I cannot give you one definitive definition. I will tell you my favorite resource for trying to explore some of these is Anatomy Trains by Thomas Myers. They do have a definition in there, but it's about a paragraph long. I don't want to just read you a paragraph right now. I think it's so much more than that. Fascia is a dense, irregular connective tissue. And I was taught it wraps packages, holds things together, and it's like the glue, but also it allows us to move. Okay, that's what I learned. End of story. And although that's not wrong, I would say that that's completely incomplete. Because what we've learned more recently with the technology of in vivo cameras, that's where some of this curiosity for fascia began to be sparked. Was, maybe 50 years ago is when we started putting cameras inside living bodies. There is a beautiful video on YouTube. It's called Strolling Under the Skin, and it shows lots of images of what fascia is doing inside of a living body. And it's a beautiful video and it explains a lot. But because it's not just wrapping and packaging, what we're exploring now through research is the amount of nervous communication that's occurring in the fascia. And, it is, I think I just read that it's the most densely innervated tissue in the body. Don't quote me on that. Because there's lots of new articles coming through, and I try to be very careful about quoting only peer-reviewed research. Okay, so that I think that's very important because there is science out there studying fascia right now, and I don't want the science to be confused with the opinion pieces that are coming out on fascia. And I think that's where there's a gray area and some confusion about what fascia is. I think there's some really fascinating research about, because this tissue is so deeply innervated, and how fascia responds to frequency treatment. Sometimes I use tuning forks in my treatments, but most often I just use my hands. But there is some speculation that fascia can perceive frequencies or energies in the environment around our body before we can logically perceive it. So that's being researched. I can't necessarily tell you how that works, but I do think it's really interesting. And this interesting work that's coming out and all this science that is being done. First of all, we need more research. But I'm really passionate about trying to educate at the undergrad level, because that's where we can spark curiosity and get more people asking the scientific research questions that I want to have answered.
Yeah, I imagine that these new findings are suggesting that fascia play a role in movement, in communication from one tissue to another, in proprioception. That sounds like this is the case, and I can't imagine that there is not a clinically significant application to this. So, what has your experience been in terms of the clinically significant developments with the bigger understanding of fascia?
Yeah, well, that's where us fascia enthusiasts or fascia therapists, that's where we get a little, we exude our confidence of what fascia is when we don't even necessarily know exactly what it is. But I do think that we are seeing huge improvements in our clients through fascia work. And again, I can't tell you how often I hear the story that, oh, I've tried everything, I'm desperate. I did my own research and I found information about fascia, and that's how I came to you. And I really want people to have to stop going through jumping through all those hoops, because I've seen how fascia work applied to the body correctly can really make big differences. And I talk a lot about chronic pain, but there's also some things that I've learned in class about how fascia work can help people with neurological conditions like cerebral palsy. There's a video that I'm trying to get the John Barnes Institute to share with me so that I could share it at HAPS, because if I could get more people to see this video of this little girl with cerebral palsy, they showed it to us in class. They have a before video of her moving and an after video. And, before, that spasticity, that rigidity of her body, she could barely walk. After 2 weeks of intensive myofascial release treatment, she was skipping up and down the halls. And that right there, that is changing quality of life. Now, in that particular case, with cerebral palsy, that's an upper motor neuron condition. That's not something I can change, but we can affect some of the symptoms and the experiences that she's having by releasing the tension that is being held in her fascia from the spasticity that comes from her central nervous system.
So, what exactly is myofascial release therapy? What are you anatomically influencing during a treatment?
So, and there are different schools of thought. So I just want to make sure to just point out again that my perspective is that I was trained by John Barnes and his clinicians. There are other ways to think about fascia. Ida Rolf is another person who's really done a lot of work in fascia. Carla Stecco. There are others. I just want to make sure to mention them. But I think it's really important to expose the lens through which I found fascia work, and that was through John Barnes, who teaches hands-on treatment to affect the fascia. So let's talk about that for a second. So what we've learned about fascia is that it is very receptive to treatment through the proper pressure, but not just the right amount of pressure, holding that pressure for the right amount of time. Okay, so when I find a restriction in the fascia, I feel that with my hands. I've been trained and taught and mentored, lots of mentoring to learn that skill of finding a restriction with my hands, but then putting that tissue on compression, stretch, or pull. Sometimes I'm pulling on an entire extremity and affecting all of the fascia through that extremity and all the way up. But then having to hold those techniques for several minutes. And this is where the research is really fun and exciting to me, a fascia nerd. You know, when John was first teaching fascia work, they were encouraging therapists to hold the techniques for a minimum of 2 minutes. Well, what the more recent research has showed us, if we can hold our techniques, if we can keep that fascia stimulated more like 5 minutes, maybe even 7 or 8 minutes, we are releasing the restrictions in the fascia, and we are also stimulating anti-inflammatory markers in the body. And that to me is really fascinating. There are some other case studies that have shown some people with cancer receiving fascia work, and that fascia work helping to eliminate that very inflamed tissue. There are some slides of the cancer that show us in class. There was a slide, here's the before picture. Here are the slides that show the cancerous tissue. This person went and just did 3 weeks of intensive myofascial release. Here's the next slide. The doctor made that patient come back 3 times to make sure that, is this real? How did that happen? How did your cancer go away? The only thing she did was myofascial release. And my theory, there are only theories, this has not been studied. My theory is that trying to put the body into an anti-inflammatory state can help combat those cancerous tissues.
Okay, I want to break in here and discuss what Dr. Oland said about cancer. To be clear, I could not find any clinical data available to support the theory that myofascial release can cure cancer. So I want to make sure that everyone is aware that this is an anecdotal account of a case study and not scientific evidence that myofascial release is a viable treatment option for cancer itself. However, there is evidence published in a journal called Supportive Care for Cancer that myofascial release technique is an effective treatment for the musculoskeletal side effects of conservative breast cancer surgery and radiation therapy. I will put a link to that article in the show notes if anyone wants to read more about it.
Most people don't realize how much of their personal information is being bought and sold every day. Data brokers are making billions pulling details about you from public records and the internet, then packaging and selling it, usually without your consent. That's how your information lands in the hands of scammers, spammers, even stalkers. That's where Aura comes in. Aura actively removes your data from broker sites and keeps it off. They also instantly alert you if your information shows up in a breach or on the dark web. But Aura goes beyond data protection. With one app, you get a VPN, antivirus, password manager, spam call protection, dark web monitoring, and even up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. All backed by 24/7 US-based fraud support. Other companies might just sell credit monitoring or just a VPN. Aura gives you all of that together at the same price competitors charge for just one service. Start your free trial today at aura.com/prevent. Protect yourself now at aura.com/prevent.
So, what patients, what conditions do you think are most likely to benefit from myofascial release?
So I'm really interested in what the science is going to show us about how myofascial release affects people with fibromyalgia. My theory is that fibromyalgia is just disordered fascia. And when you treat the fascia, especially with the people that I've worked with, treating fascia with people who have fibromyalgia, it feels like magic. And I just get so much joy helping people find a pain-free life, especially after dealing with intense pain for so long. So I do believe fibromyalgia is a condition that really responds well. Chronic fatigue syndrome, that's another one. And when we get into the weeds about what fascia is and how restrictions affect our bodies at the cellular level, and how, there are mitochondria that live within the fascia. And if there's a restriction there, those tissues aren't functioning. They're not getting hydration, they're not getting nutrition, they're not getting oxygenation. And so treating someone who has chronic fatigue syndrome, often there's impaired posture, impaired flexibility, impaired tissue extensibility. So I think chronic fatigue syndrome often falls into a psychiatric condition, not all the time, but that's kind of the realm. When a physical clinician, a doctor, a PT can't help someone with pain, very often I think we start to gaslight people and say, oh, it's all in their head. This is a psychiatric condition. And I do believe we're in an epidemic of gaslighting patients. And I think often the ego of a clinician, if I can't get to the root of this problem, well, I'm just going to blame it on the patient. And I just think that's something that needs to change across the boards in our healthcare system, but especially with people dealing with fascia issues. I think that they often get dismissed. And I think that's unfortunate. But often that's how someone ends up in my room, because they've tried everything. They haven't found someone who can help them. They won't be complacent, which is, I think, huge. Advocating for yourself in this healthcare world is very important. That's often how people find me. Now, in my office myself, my favorite area of the body to work on is neck and cranium. I have a really wonderful referral source from an orthodontist. She sends me lots of people with TMJ dysfunction or with migraines. And again, those are people who, but have some serious pain, and it can be hard to find the right help for TMJ dysfunction and migraines. So, those are conditions that, before fascia work, I don't know that I ever felt confident treating that type of patient. But now I'm trying to seek them out. I'm trying to get them to find me and find fascia work, because I think that it can be very helpful. I have a gentleman coming in tonight. He's the gentleman that drives 90 minutes to get to me. This will be his 4th session tonight. Between visits 2 and 3, he didn't have a single migraine. And he doesn't remember the last time he'd been more than 1 day without a migraine. So that's very exciting. And I'm really, really grateful that they sought me out so that I could help them work through this.
That is really exciting. I had someone on recently, we talked about Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and I had someone talking about multiple sclerosis. And I think you hit on something when you had said that the clinician tends to blame the patient when it seems like they can't figure out what's going on. And I think a lot of that stems to something I remember from when I was in school. We were taught how to see if someone was malingering or not. And one of the ways that we were taught to do that is if they say it hurts all over, right? Like that was kind of a sign that they're not being truthful about their symptoms. However, when you have something like Ehlers-Danlos, which is a connective tissue disorder, or fibromyalgia, which might be a fascia disorder, fascia's everywhere, connective tissue's everywhere. So it kind of makes sense that that might be the case. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because I do agree that clinicians need to stop blaming patients.
Yes, we need to stop gaslighting our patients. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up EDS, because, when I was learning about how fascial work can help with EDS, so Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, it's a connective tissue disorder, and often people are complaining of hyperflexibility. And I thought, well, don't they need restriction then? Wouldn't it make sense? But here's what can happen. So that connective tissue disorder might make their joints more lax, then their muscles and their fascia become more restricted to kind of make up for that. But those restrictions can cause more problems. So I have several EDS clients right now, and this treatment goes with lots of education, because I am there to reduce the strain pattern that becomes a problem. But also we have to protect their joints. We have to talk about ways to reduce strain on their joints. So proper footwear, proper posture, maybe using some kinesio tape for that proprioceptive reminder to hold themselves in a proper posture to protect those joints. But releasing the pathological restrictions in the tissue does relieve pain, which helps most people. When you relieve pain, most people are just going to move better and more in a more healthy manner.
Got it. So when you talked about the studies or lack of studies, and people are researching it right now, is there any scientific evidence currently to support the effectiveness of myofascial release therapy with some of these conditions?
Oh, well, pertaining to specific conditions, I don't want to make any claims right now. Off the cuff with you like this, I can't remember what has been peer-reviewed research, what's been a case study that I've heard about in class. So I don't know that I can speak specifically to science and specific conditions. I do know that there's a lot of work being done right now in the biotensegrity field, trying to determine how fascia restrictions affect how we move our bodies. So I can tell you that's some research I have been following. You know, when I was in PT school, I was taught about each individual muscle, origin, insertion, action, etc., and how when a muscle contracts, how it affects the bones. What I really am interested in seeing is how we can study the amount of pressure a fascia restriction can put into the structures of the body, as well as how that restriction can affect the biomechanics. So I know there's research in that realm. There's some big names working on that. Carlos Deco, I think, is one of them. There's a male researcher, I can't remember his name off the top of my head right now, but they are doing lots of work in that realm. So I can speak to that. But when it comes to certain conditions, like I said, I just can't off the top of my head remember what's peer-reviewed science and what is a case study. I don't want to discount case studies. That is where I have found my passion. You know, I mentioned a couple case studies to you already, like the cancer case study they presented to us. Many therapists that I meet in fascia class have become fascia therapists because of the changes in their body that help them with infertility. And that is something that is becoming more of a problem, or maybe we're just talking more openly about it. But think about that. If there's a fascia restriction around our genitals, well, things aren't going to get to where they need to go. So I think that I'm also really interested to see some science in those areas as well.
Yeah, definitely we would need to see some studies when it comes to some kind of manual therapy affecting things like you mentioned cancer earlier or infertility. I would definitely like to see some peer-reviewed studies that can show some data on those.
Yeah, there is an article if it interests anybody, and this is not a new article. I think it came out in the late 90s by Mark Barnes. Now, Mark is the son of John Barnes. I studied under John. In 1997, I think it came out. And he discussed some of the scientific principles behind why fascia work is working.
I found the article Dr. Oland mentioned. It is in fact from 1997, and I put a link to it in the show notes if anyone is interested in reading it.
He talked about the extracellular matrix and how that has a piezoelectrical response to touch. And so what that means basically, so fascia, we do know fascia is considered to be a liquid crystalline texture, if you will, or substance. And when it gets restricted, it does turn into more of a solid. And I can feel that with my hands. You know, if you have a knot in your muscle, whether it's a knot of the muscle or a fascial restriction, or maybe a little bit of both, you know, when my hands are on a restriction for a prolonged period of time, not all the time, but often it feels almost like a buzzing under my hand. Sometimes it might, especially in the abdominal region, when I have my hands in that area releasing fascia, it almost feels like my hands on the surface of carbonated water. It almost feels like bubbles are coming to the top of the water. And I believe that's the piezoelectric response of the fascia. And when that tissue goes from more of a solid state back into more of that liquid crystalline state, that's when we get the flow of energy and the flow of nutrients and water and oxygen to the tissues themselves. So that is some of the properties that is held in fascia that I just think is fascinating.
Yes, fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you for laughing at my
So,
joke.
so relatively recently, in the last couple of years or so, I was reading some articles where researchers were describing the interstitium.
Mhm, mhm.
And rather than the interstitial fluid that we kind of talk about or the fascia between tissues, they were describing it as more of a widespread network of fluid-filled spaces supported by collagen bundles. And then they talked about these spaces being continuous across tissues and organs, where there might be some communication from tissues to organs through this interstitium. Do you think this is functionally related to fascia?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. It's definitely related. Now, this is where, if I were giving a lecture on fascia, and if I was talking about the physiological aspects of fascia, which is not my strength, okay? I'm a PT. I like the big picture. Anatomy is definitely my strength, but I've taken a dive into the physiology of fascia. And we got to split some hairs so the interstitium, which some people are calling it a discovery of a new organ, which I don't necessarily agree with.
I did hear that. They were calling it the largest organ in the body.
Right, right. So let's go back to definitions for a second, Steve. So an organ is defined as a structure comprised of a minimum of two different tissues working symbiotically for a specific function, and then it's encapsulated, right? So when you look at the interstitium, it's certainly not encapsulated. It is a space. And this is when I'm teaching my students, I say, man, this kind of drives me nuts that we have all these spaces in our body that we're naming nothing almost, right? We're naming spaces, but those spaces are so important that they need a name and a definition. So when we talk about the physiological aspects of fascia, we got to split some hairs, okay? We have our ground substance, and ground substance is going to be the liquid that or supposedly a liquid state that surrounds all of our cells. And there's going to be some fibrous materials in there like collagen and elastin. We have our extracellular matrix that has the ground substance plus some other fibrous materials in it as well. The interstitium is going to be housed within the extracellular matrix and the ground substance. It's not going to be differentiated, right? So there's definitely connections, and I think that we are just at the beginning of exploring the similarities and the differences between these substances that are overlapping, but also very different.
It makes a lot of sense. Again, we tend to teach in anatomy that fascia is the stuff that's separating our muscles from each other and things like that. And I guess that would make sense with your cerebral palsy experience with that particular case study. When you have an upper motor neuron issue that is causing muscles to be involuntarily contracted, well, whatever those muscles are connected to via fascia, they're also going to get pulled in that direction as well. And I could see how the myofascial release would help alleviate some of the anatomical struggles that you would see. It makes total sense.
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned the case that I saw of that little girl, but one of my longest term, bestest clients is a woman my age who has cerebral palsy, and she gets relief from what we do. Her story is very interesting. She's also a physician and has a very physical job. She is in a chair most of the time, but sometimes has to stand up to perform trachs, and it can be very hard on her body. And she comes in regular as can be every week. And she actually went to Arizona with me to get treated at one of John's centers. And that was really a great opportunity for me. So here was one of my long-term clients being treated by the expert in this field, getting extensive fascia work done in 1 week, and to see her from the beginning of the week to the end of the week and just see how that intensive work really compiled and helped her to move better. As well as I was learning alongside some of the experts in my field as well with this person's body that I know so well. It was a really, really interesting week of learning for me.
Yeah, when I was in school, we used to learn about something called active release technique, or ART. And this was, I think, the person who developed it was in Colorado. You had to go to Colorado to get trained to do it. But it seemed like kind of similar to what you're talking about, except we would put our thumbs in between two muscles, let's say in the forearm. And the client would then contract the muscles while you stayed still. That's the active part. And breaking up the adhesions in the fascia between the muscles. I wonder if that's kind of similar to what you're describing.
Well, so I have incorporated some ART into my treatments. I've been trained in that. I love to use it up here in the upper traps, between the upper traps and maybe getting into the scalenes. So there's some similar principles for sure. The way I've been trained, though, through the John Barnes technique is, and one of the reasons it really called to me was they preach saving our own bodies. My thumbs, I have to be real careful with them because every now and then I'll get a little bit of a flare of arthritis if I use them too much. So a lot of the training in my classes is how to perform myofascial release in a way that it doesn't harm my body, because we do hold the techniques for so long. we have to be very protective of our bodies as well. So like you said, the ART is, I think, a great resource. I am not as extensively trained in that as I am in myofascial release. Something that I really love is that, yes, I'm a myofascial release heavy practice, but I have some other fun tools up my sleeve that I've learned along the way as well. But also something that called me to the John Barnes technique is he really preached how important it is for us as therapists to take care of our own bodies. And I think, generally speaking, I've been working in the medical field for almost 25 years, and as providers, we tend to be the worst at taking care of ourselves. And so I do believe it's so important if you're going to be caring for another human being, which is my full-time job, you got to take care of yourself as well.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of being a therapist, I want to throw this out there and ask you, for the listeners who might be considering becoming a physical therapist, what did it take for you to become one? What is the schooling like? I know that most physical therapists now, it's a doctoral degree, not a master's degree, which is what it was back when I was in school. It seems like most programs go all the way through to DPT. So could you shed a little light on that for the listeners who might be considering a career in physical therapy?
Yeah, and I think this, not just for those wanting to go into physical therapy, I think it's so important for everybody to understand this, because some of the roadblocks I hit in my field are people thinking they have to go to their physician for everything. But let's start at the beginning. When I entered the field in 2005, I had a master's degree I did all my education at St. Louis University. I could work with a master's degree, but I believe it was 2015 when it's actually been required. You have to get a doctoral level degree in order to become an entry-level therapist. So my perspective on the whole thing, it was an exciting time to become a physical therapist. I got my master's. I can tell you that the difference in the rigor with which I had to treat my education, undergrad was one thing, getting my master's was heavy. That was some really intense schooling. I believe that probably just all the requirements to become a physical therapist, that master's level education just grew and grew and grew and grew and got so big that it just made sense to make it a doctoral level degree, because I graduated with my master's. And I think to get a doctorate on top of that was 18 more credit hours. So for me, it was a little bit different than what students are experiencing now, because I was able to work full-time with a master's. I was taking part-time doctoral level courses, and most of those were online, which back in 2005, online learning was kind of new. And it was really strange to have gone through all of my education in person and then switching over to online learning. So it was different. Now I had 2 classes where I had to come into St. Louis U for the weekend to complete a course that I was working on for my doctoral level degree. But now I believe if you come in as a freshman and you are automatically into their graduate level program, I believe it's a 7-year process, but the pay is not any different. I got my doctorate degree and my pay did not change. Now, I was able to work chip away at it at a time, but a whole nother semester at a private university, I mean, that's a lot of money to be spending on your education. And we need to be making sure, I think, that these clinicians are getting paid at their value. And I can tell you right now, I don't think the average physical therapist is getting paid their value. But that was part of my inspiration to start a private practice.
Yeah, I would say that's probably accurate.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So the education it was science heavy. I always loved math. I always loved physics. That came naturally to me, and that was helpful. The anatomy part it's informationally dense, and straight up memorization for me was very, very hard. But I studied hard. I got through it. And, anatomy was probably one of the most challenging classes for me, but it's one of my passions. When I had the opportunity to come back and start teaching anatomy, I jumped at it.
That's how I felt as well. I had a similar trajectory, and my listeners already know I'm not going to get into it, but I started as an adjunct, did that for 3 years, got hired full-time. Now it's 24 years later, still teaching anatomy and physiology. It is a great gig. I will definitely give it that.
Yeah, and for me, really, after 20 years of working in the field, to come back and have to, I can admit this now, I had to relearn a lot of anatomy before I could
Same.
teach it. Yeah, I had to relearn it. And then that coupled with diving into treating the whole body as opposed to dissecting it down, treating the whole body, I really am grateful for the timing of all these experiences because I think my fascia education coupled with my anatomy teaching really helped my career as a therapist.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just the idea of spending years after school practicing as a clinician, and then all of a sudden you have to start teaching people about pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and you're like,
I
wait, what
know.
was that again? And so yeah, or messenger RNA. Like, how often are you thinking about messenger RNA when you're treating someone's rotator cuff?
Yeah, yeah, it's different.
So
It's very different. But it all, it all comes together, especially with fascia work. So that's been fun to see that all come together again.
You didn't start a business just to keep the lights on. You're here to sell more today than yesterday. You're here to win. Lucky for you, Shopify built the best converting checkout on the planet. Like the just one tapping, ridiculously fast acting, sky-high sales stacking, champion of checkouts. That's the good stuff right there. So if your business is in it to win it, win with Shopify. Start your free trial today at shopify.com/win.
well, thank you once again. You've been really generous with your time and joining me and sharing your expertise. Is there anything you'd like to share with the listeners that I haven't thought of?
Oh gosh. Well, I just hope that this conversation inspires some curiosity about fascia. Steve, I'll email you my lecture. I have an actual lecture designed for entry-level A&P students that I am giving away because I just want people to start incorporating this into their education. So if you would, I'm going to share that with you. I would love for people to take a listen.
Is that something I can put a link to in the show notes so people can find it?
Absolutely. It's a YouTube video. Yep, I'll email it. It's a YouTube video.
I will put all pertinent links in the show notes so that people can find you. They can find you on social media. They can, if you have a website, just let me know. The YouTube video, all of it will be accessible. Just check the show notes.
Yes, little plug. So part of the reason I'm giving away this lecture for free is because it's kind of like a commercial for my big project that's coming to fruition 4 years later. I am in the process of launching an online platform that is designed to educate and empower people to take care of themselves, also hoping to inspire more clinicians to go into private practice. Because in private practice, I've taken over my life. I'm no longer grinding my wheels out. The system's not using my empathy to make money. I am using my empathy to help people and have a sustainable life. Anyways, my business is called Thrive Everywhere. ThriveEverywhere.com should be going live in the next 2 to 3 months. My podcast is going to be housed there. There's educational opportunities there, really trying to help educate the general public on how to better interact with their healthcare coverage. I think so many people are confused about health insurance and just avoid it until it becomes a problem. And I think if we could all come together and help each other better navigate that system, I think we'll all get more out of it. But the biggest product I have is the directory that is for private practice clinicians only. I want to shine a spotlight on private practice because I don't think the average person knows the difference between corporate healthcare and private practice. And my patent for the directory is the search filters. So people can come to this site and they can search for their provider using their symptoms, their diagnosis if they have it, or the specialty services that they're looking for. Because I think it can be kind of tricky to know who can help you with the problems with your body. So this is a way to find some resources of other ways to care for ourselves.
Excellent. I will put a link to all that in the show notes so that everybody can check it out. You said the name of your website was?
It's thriveeverywhere.com. We are not live yet, so I don't know when that's going to happen, but it's looking like 2 to 3 months from now, we're going to actually go live. This is, again, a long-term project.
So fall of 2026.
Hopefully. Here's hoping.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, the link's going to be in the show notes. So if you're listening, click on it, see if it works, and then you'll know because people could be listening to this a year from now.
If any of your students have any questions about fascia work, especially I'm looking to try to help mentor people that are going into research. One of my former students is a medical student doing a research project on fascia. I myself am not set up to do research, but I love talking about different ideas of how we can learn about it.
Well, that's great. I hope that people seek you out, and it sounds like it could be really helpful for everybody involved. Thanks again, Kate. I really appreciate you coming on.
Steve, thank you for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time and seeking me out to come on the show. Thank you.
Once again, thank you to Dr. Kate Oland for sharing a wealth of information and expertise about fascia and myofascial release therapy. As I mentioned, there will be several links in the show notes so you can learn more about what we discussed. They will include Dr. Oland's lecture, website, podcast, and the articles we talked about. Thanks for listening. I hope you learned something valuable in this episode, and as always, I hope this podcast is helping you get your B or better in A&P. Good luck, be well, and I'll talk to you next time. Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit is a production of Minus 55 Media and is hosted by the Believe Network. Please take the time to rate the podcast and leave a review. You can also check out the content I post on Instagram and YouTube as @StudentHelp4AP. That's Student Help, the number 4, AP. Special thanks to my family, Bucks County Community College, and McGraw-Hill Education, where your instructor can find Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite, my low-cost, tutor video-based digital learning solution for anatomy and physiology currently being used at several colleges and universities. If your instructor isn't using Digital Suite, let them know about it. The link is in the show notes.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.